Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. Hi, today is July 8th, 2025. Thank you. Hope everybody had a great July 4th weekend. I know I did. Quiet, just stay around. There are a lot of headlines on China. But obviously the bigger headlines is in the U.S. as President Trump's tariff rates on China. So I think I'll put these things together and quickly review what kind of stimulus is Chinese government trying, what kind of policies it's trying, as well as the current tariff rates and its impact on China. I think if you follow me and I've heard this series for a while, one thing probably it's a little bit counterintuitive and which we've pointed out actually. In terms of trade war, trade itself, China is probably in some ways relatively positioned than other countries in terms of dealing with the U.S. And actually now it's clear that, while a lot of countries are still trying to get a deal with the U.S., really the three, countries that has had a deal with the U.S. is China, UK, and Vietnam. So China is not in the headline, even though a lot of these tariff rates are targeting China. So actually, if you look at all the letters, it has this line says, goods go through third country, goods going through will face a higher rate, which essentially is a code word for China. So, for example, President Trump is putting close to 25% tariff rates on Japan and South Korea. A lot of these rates will come down after negotiations. But again, I think the framework is still similar. That U.S. goal is to have a higher tariff rates for every country and have about 20% extra higher rates on China. Now, whether it's 20% or 30%, it depends on the political wind. So like even this morning, you see President Trump or yesterday talking about 10% extra for BRICS countries. Now, a lot of these, President Trump sometimes is using it as a negotiation tool, not necessarily 10% in the final. But as you can see that, the way he's been using a lot of these, putting maximum pressure and get something approach. And it's been pretty successful, I think. In terms of China, though, China actually have relatively have something that can retaliate, and which it did. And if you notice since April to now, the so-called Liberation Day, China is the only country that has retaliated and actually used that to get a deal that's not necessarily relatively bad for China. So actually yesterday, when you see all these tariff rates got handed out in letter forms, the immediate impact on China tech is actually not that much negative versus the other countries. Now, over a longer run, China will face these so-called tariff war, and it's all going to depend on how other countries are going to enforce China's shipments through these countries because the tariff rate on Chinese goods is going to be about 20 to 30% higher than a typical tariff rates that goes through Vietnam. So I think Vietnam is actually the most informative. I think UK deal is not as informative because UK actually runs, US actually runs a trade surplus with UK, so it's easy for US to give a 10%. But I think the Vietnam deal is much more indicative of the whole framework in the sense that it's 20% for Vietnam goods to the US, it's 0% tariff for US goods to Vietnam, and it's 40% if it's transshipment, which is slightly cheaper than the actual tariff rate on the Chinese goods, which is closer to 50 to 55%. So I think this is likely to go. And for countries that U.S. is going to be very difficult to enforce transshipment, like I think Cambodia or or like Myanmar, and I think those places, essentially the tariff rate is similar to the so-called potential transshipment rate. So because it's just very difficult for US to go enforce, what kind of goods is transshipment, which are made in those countries. So overall, I think the impact on China is somewhat muted short run. In the long run, it really depends on how these countries deal with Chinese goods, and then how US is making production more in US, so-called US friendly countries. Now, how this is going to go, it's not necessarily easy, right? Because it's not easy to move manufacturing into US. It's very expensive. US is extremely expensive to produce. And even for countries that's closer to US, for example, like Mexico, it is having an investment boom because a lot of Chinese firms have invested. So, for example, car companies is building up in Mexico and in Brazil. Now, whether US feel that's okay, that Chinese capital is behind those operations, and those cars may get into the US market, even though for now I don't think US is going to open the market. But again, all these are going to we're going to have to wait and see, right? You cannot discount Chinese entrepreneurs. You can also not discount the US entrepreneurs in its progress. Ultimately, the trade war is fought in the front of technology war. How US and China does in AI will help win the so-called trade war. So trade war is a start, is what's going on now. But I think the more fundamental war is a tech war, which both China and the US is investing significantly in the AI efforts and in robotics, which will be very important in future manufacturing. So again, with this background for China, and in domestically China equity is doing okay, particularly the Hong Kong Hong Kong listed stocks, which is for us is about 67, 2/3 of the portfolio for our China portfolio, for our China strategy. So the issues has not done as well. On the other hand, the drawdown in issues is less, so the volatility is higher. However, in the recent run up, the Hong Kong listed stocks has done better. So domestically, China is doing some stimulus through consumption coupons. The first beginning of the year is mainly consumption coupon for durable goods, and we expect this to be expanded into services. Services is not a very big part of Chinese economy, which actually means that the room for stimulus is high. So I think the government will do something. On the other hand, again, this is our baseline for the last 2 years, and it's the same. I don't think there's significant change. Is that China will do it, but it's just going to do enough that it does not go for the kind of big stimulus that people are hoping for. So I think your expectation has to adjust. If you are too optimistic, then you need to dial down. If you are too pessimistic, you need to dial up on your China exposure. Ultimately, for China, it is very, I think it's a long-term investment. It's a hedge for the possibility that China could make a significant tech advancement and keep its position in the second, most advanced manufacturing country. But the volatility will come because if you see a lot of U.S. foreign policies, whether it's trade policy or tech policy, China is the number one competitor of the U.S. And that's not going to change really very closely. It really not in the next 5 years. Maybe in 10 years we'll see. I'll be 60 years old. um, Maybe to wrap this up, a little bit, very local news in China. That's not very, no Western news is probably going to report. In domestically, China, is having a lot of debates, particularly the younger people who are different, who are less differential to the government, but they are also more nationalistic. So I think when you think about the younger generation of Chinese, on the one hand, they grew up, much better life. So they actually, their support of the party is probably, more than typical person realize. On the other hand, they grew up in the market-based economy, so they are not as, as the joke is, they are not as easy to lead, to be led by the party. So there is a train that got really hot, and the train conductors, which is representing the government, didn't want to open the window, and then one of the guy, after a long discussion with them, decided to just smash the window. And then it becomes a very sensitive topic. A lot of video got censored, and there's this huge discussion of, are Chinese too timid when they are facing government, or the thing could be handled better by the railroad, which actually in a similar event, 5 years ago, they actually apologized to the people, but this time they somehow, it was a different line of the railroad, and they, as soon as they came out, they were very, they were not apologizing, and they think they were right in giving, criticism to this guy who smashed the window. He is, looking from a lot of these censored videos, which I got a hold of, he looks very, he looks young, not 15, 16, but he looks in his 20s. And people do support him when he smashed it. But when he got led, then, not enough people stand up and said he should not be, led. But he got a verbal criticism. And even that, I think a lot of Chinese netizens are not happy that, that he should be hailed as a good Samaritan, and by smashing the window so that people don't get overheat, instead of being, lectured and criticized by the railroad. So that's the kind of things in local Chinese. I think that's rarely going to get into the U.S. media. But ultimately, these kind of discussions and these kind of events change the way, subtly on how Chinese think about the party. Also recently, I didn't even want to comment, but there are a lot of fringe accounts saying, President Xi is losing power, or that he is now, he's not, he's going to be pushed out. For those kind of things, it's actually very easy to answer. I think a lot of those came from the Falun Gong section of the U.S. media, which they have been very influential in the U.S. And they sometimes push quite sometimes very, very like unfounded misinformation. I'm not going to go criticizing them, because they were also, prosecuted by the government for many years. But I just want to point this out, that when you're thinking about China, those kind of rumors, which is like, okay, that's a huge deviation from a baseline. What the baseline in China is actually the party enjoys broad support. And even President Xi, his support is also more than 50%. I think for a lot of people, because of the way the Communist Party is portrayed here, they couldn't quite understand it. But again, unless you got a news that is so different from the baseline, then you really need a very hard evidence to believe that kind of. So unless there is very hard evidence, I think these kind of news, you can really just write it off, like not even, part of the conversation. Now, sometimes I did wade in on Twitter to comment, to kind of make fun a little bit about these. There's some some ideas that President Xi cannot leave China now because he's, pushed by the power. Honestly, President Trump is likely to visit China, so and meet with President Xi. So I think a lot of those headlines, which deviates so significantly from what China is, then you need really, really hard evidence. Again, there are several of these kind of issues. We don't need to go into details, but if you're interested, you can leave messages on Twitter for me, and I can, try to comment on this as an illustration of how to look at, news out of China or commentary out of China without, being led into really completely astray. Again, so as a summarize, you can hear our podcast on Apple, on Spotify, on our website. You can, follow me on Twitter. You can access to our past episodes pretty easily. And we always, look forward to hear your feedback in terms of what kind of topics that you're interested in. For China equity, I think for now, it's still valid that you do want to own some in your portfolio. On the other hand, like how much you're willing to take the risk, how much you want to, it really depends on how risk preference you want, and then how much of a bet you want to put it on. So we have a slew of products that goes from 0% China to full China, and you can check those on our website as well. Thank you.